The silence in the elder's longhouse was a living thing. It had a scent: old wood smoke, dried herbs, and the sour tang of fear sweating from the skin of the other girls. It had a weight pressing down on Mira's shoulders until her bones felt brittle. She sat on the hard-carved bench, her spine straight, her hands resting in her lap. She did not need to see the faces around her to know their expressions. She could hear them in the shallow, trembling breaths, in the rustle of a woolen shawl pulled tighter. This was the silence of a reaping. "The tribute is owed," Elder Maeve's voice rasped, thin and dry as autumn leaves. "The alpha of the Blackwood requires a bride. The pact must be honored." A shudder passed through the room, a collective wave of terror that Mira felt against her skin like a cold draft. The alpha of the Blackwood. They didn't even use his name. It was a curse on the tongue, a name that belonged to ghost stories whispered around a dying fire. Kaelin Dross, the alpha whose gaze was death. Mira listened. She had always been a good listener. It was her version of sight. She heard the frantic, rabbit-quick heartbeat of Ilya to her left. She heard the soft, desperate prayer that fell from Lyra's lips on her right. They were afraid of his eyes, of the curse that said he could wither a soul with a single look. But Mira had no fear of a man's gaze. The world had gone dark for her when she was 7, stolen by a fever that had left her with nothing but shapes of memory and a landscape of sound and scent. A man's eyes were just a story to her, a myth. The elder's wooden staff tapped the stone floor, once, twice. The sound echoed in the suffocating quiet. "Our offerings in the past have been insufficient," Maeve said, and Mira could smell the lie in her words, the bitter scent of guilt. Insufficient was a soft word for what happened to the girls who were sent before. Girls who were returned to the border of their lands weeks later, pale and empty, their minds shattered. They spoke of no violence, no cruelty, only of a look, a terrible, silent emptiness that unmade them from the inside out. "He requires a wife," the elder continued, her voice gaining a sharp, desperate edge. "One who will not break." Mira felt a shift in the air, a change in the current of the room's fear. It was no longer a shared dread. It was focusing, turning. She felt the subtle lean of bodies away from her on the bench. The heartbeats around her were still frantic, but now they were laced with something else: relief. Mira Thalin. Her name fell into the silence like a stone into a deep well. It was not a question, it was a sentence. Mira did not flinch. She simply tilted her head, her ear tuned to the elder's voice. She heard the tremor in it, the old woman's attempt to sound resolute, to sound as if this was an honor. It was not an honor. It was an execution. They were sending the broken lamb to the wolf, hoping it would be too plain a meal to bother with. The blind girl, the one who could not meet his gaze, and therefore could not be broken by it. A clever, cruel solution. "You will go," Maeve declared. The finality of it was like a cage door slamming shut. Mira felt a hand on her arm. It was her father. His palm was rough, calloused, but his grip trembled. He smelled of sawdust and sorrow. He said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence screamed his shame, his helplessness. He was giving her away to save someone else's daughter, to save Elia or Lyra or any of the others who could see the sun, who could marry and give the pack strong-eyed children, who were whole. She stood, letting him guide her. The air parted around her as she walked. The other girls, the other families, they moved away as if she were carrying a plague. Perhaps she was. The plague of a monster's attention. She was dressed in a simple white tunic, the traditional garb for a tribute bride. It felt thin and useless against the sudden chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. 2 pack sentinels took her arms at the door, their grips hard and impersonal. They smelled of leather, steel, and a nervous sweat they were trying to hide. "Be brave, daughter," her father whispered, his voice thick. It was the last thing she would ever hear him say. Then she was outside. The wind was sharp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth from the forest that bordered their lands. The Blackwood, his territory. It smelled different from their own woods. Wilder, colder, ancient. The journey was silent. The sentinels did not speak to her. They walked on either side, their heavy footfalls a constant rhythm on the forest floor. Mira focused on the sounds around her, the snap of a twig under a boot, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of a small creature in the undergrowth. This was her world. It had always been enough. She wondered briefly what his world sounded like. The world of a cursed alpha, living in a silence of his own making. Did he hear the fear he caused? Did he smell it on the wind, a constant poison? Hours passed. The air grew colder, heavier. The scent of pine deepened, joined by the smell of wet stone and something else. Something elemental and wild. It was the scent of a predator, male, powerful. It made the hairs on her arms stand on end, and it had nothing to do with the cold. Her wolf, a quiet, timid thing she rarely felt, stirred within her. A small nervous whimper deep in her soul. It sensed him. Even from this distance, it knew. The ground beneath her feet changed, from soft earth to hard-hewn stone. The sounds of the forest fell away, replaced by an oppressive, echoing silence. A keep. They had arrived. A massive door, she imagined, groaned open. The sound was deep, resonating through the stone and up into the soles of her feet. She was guided inside, and the cold became absolute. It was a dead cold, the kind that leached the warmth from your blood. The air was thick with the smell of dust, old fires, and that same dominant masculine scent. Ozone and winter frost. It clung to everything. This was his den. The sentinels released her arms, their hands pulling back as if they'd touched hot iron. "The offering from the Silver Creek pack, Alpha," one of them said, his voice shaking. Silence. Not the quiet of an empty room. This was a charged silence, a waiting silence. Mira stood perfectly still, her head held high, listening. She heard the flicker and pop of a great hearth somewhere to her right, but its warmth did not reach her. She heard the faint drip of water somewhere far away, and she heard a heartbeat. It was slow, impossibly slow, a deep, heavy thud that seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the castle. It was not the sound of a man's heart. It was the sound of a mountain, ancient, unmovable, asleep. She took a single, deliberate breath, drawing in his scent. It was overwhelming. It spoke of solitude and rage held in check for centuries. It spoke of a power that was slowly strangling itself. A floorboard creaked somewhere in the darkness in front of her, the slow, massive heartbeat quickened by a fraction. He was here. The pack sentinels behind her were barely breathing. Their fear was a stench in the air, sharp and acrid. They were terrified of him looking at them. They were staring at the floor, she was sure of it. But Mira couldn't stare at the floor. She faced the sound, she faced the scent. She faced the presence that felt like a storm cloud gathering in the vast, cold hall. A voice finally broke the stillness. It wasn't a shout. It was worse. It was a low, guttural sound, like stones grinding together in the deep earth. Another one. The words were not for her. They were a sigh of disgust, of weariness, of profound, unending loneliness. "You bore me with these pale, trembling things." The voice continued, closer now. She could feel the vibration of it in her chest. "Does your alpha think a shivering fawn will appease me? Leave it, and get out of my sight." The word it hung in the air. Not her. It. A thing. A tribute. She heard the desperate scramble of the sentinels' boots on the stone. They fled without a backward glance, their relief a palpable wave that washed over the room and then vanished. The great door boomed shut, the sound echoing for a long, long time. And then they were alone, just her and the monster of the Blackwood. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was a predator's silence, patient, watching. She felt his focus on her, a physical pressure against her skin. He was waiting, waiting for the scream, for the tears, for the collapse. Every other girl had broken by now. Mira did none of those things. She simply breathed, in and out. "You do not tremble," the voice stated. It was closer now, so close she could feel the faint stir of air as he moved. "You do not cry. Are you a fool, or simply deaf to the stories?" "I am not deaf, Alpha," she replied. Her own voice sounded small in the cavernous hall, but it was steady, clear. There was a pause. The heavy heartbeat hitched. "Look at me when you speak," he commanded, the sound a low snarl. It was a test, the one every other girl had failed. Mira smiled, a small sad curve of her lips. "I would," she said softly, "if I could." She heard a sharp intake of breath. The air crackled with something. Not anger, not pity, surprise, raw, unadulterated shock. He took a step, then another. The floor vibrated with his weight. The cold intensified as he drew near, his presence a vortex of frost and power. His scent was a wall she could almost touch, pine, snow, and the clean, sharp smell of lightning. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could have reached out and touched him. She felt the heat radiating from his body, a stark contrast to the cold he projected. It was the heat of a banked furnace. She felt his energy probe at her, searching for the fear he was accustomed to, the fear that fed his curse. But it found nothing, only a calm, quiet darkness. Her darkness. "You are blind?" he finally whispered. The word sounded alien on his tongue, as if he had never had a reason to speak it before. "Since I was a child," she confirmed. She tilted her head up towards the source of his voice, towards the place where his face would be. She offered him the only thing she had, an unseeing gaze that held no judgment, no terror. For the first time in a century, someone was looking at Kalen Dross without dying. And beneath the stone and the ice and the curse, something ancient and starved, stirred. He didn't growl, he didn't speak, he just breathed. And the Alpha King who killed with a single glance stood frozen before the one woman in the world who could not see him. The silence that followed her words was different. It was not empty. It was filled with the sound of his breathing, a harsh, ragged thing that was suddenly too loud in the cavernous space. The slow, mountain-steady heartbeat she had heard before was gone. In its place was a frantic, discordant rhythm, the sound of a sleeping beast startled awake. He moved. It was a single, heavy step back. The sound of his boots scraping against the stone was a violent crack in the stillness. He was putting distance between them. The intense heat of his body receded, and the profound cold of the hall rushed back into the space he'd occupied. "A lie," he rasped, and the sound was frayed, torn at the edges. "A ploy. They sent me a clever little bird with clipped wings, thinking I would not notice." Mira kept her face turned towards him, a compass needle finding its north. "It is no lie, Alpha. Do you think me a fool?" The rage was there, a low fire beneath the ice. "That I will be taken in by such a pathetic deception? They seek to mock the curse." "They seek to survive it," she answered, her voice quiet but firm. "They sent the one person whose life would not be forfeit by your gaze. It was not a kindness to me. It was a calculation." She heard another sharp intake of breath. He was circling her now. She could hear the faint scuff of his boots on the stone, a predator's pacing. He was trying to unsettle her, to find a crack in her calm. She stood like a statue, her head turning slowly, tracking the sound of his movement. He smelled a fury, but underneath it, there was something else. A scent she couldn't name, not yet. It was sharp and wild, like the air after a storm. Confusion. "Turn your face to the fire," he commanded. Mira hesitated for only a second before obeying. She turned to her right, feeling the distant, almost negligible warmth on her cheek. The fire popped and hissed, a lonely sound in the vast emptiness. She could hear him moving behind her. "There is no life in them," he murmured, his voice now directly behind her ear. He was so close again. The heat of him was a brand against her back, even through her thin tunic. His voice was a low vibration that traveled through her bones. "No light, they are empty." He was speaking of her eyes. The realization sent a tremor through her, one she fought to suppress. He had looked. He had bent down and stared into her face, into her sightless eyes, and his curse had found no purchase. It had found nothing to kill. He pulled away again, the sound of his footsteps retreating, growing fainter and fainter. "This changes nothing," his voice boomed from across the hall. "You are a tribute, a bargain. This castle is your cage. Do not seek me out. Do not speak to me. Find a corner and exist in it quietly. If you are fortunate, you will be forgotten." The words were cruel, meant to wound, but they were the words of a man who knew only how to wound. Then came the sound of a heavy door opening and closing in the distance. And he was gone. She was alone, truly alone. The silence he left behind was immense. It pressed in on her, a physical weight. The fire was a small, defiant sound in one corner. The drip of water was a maddening, irregular clock in another. The wind moaned outside the thick stone walls, a mournful, lonely song. This was his world. This was the sound of his solitude. Fear, cold and sharp, finally pricked at the edges of her composure. He had called this place her cage. Cages had bars, but this one had no walls she could feel. It was a vast, echoing darkness, and she was adrift in it. Breathe, Mira. She anchored herself with the simple act. In, out. She had lived in darkness her whole life. She would not be mastered by a new shade of it. She began to move. One hand held out in front of her, she took a single, shuffling step. Her boot met only stone. She took another, and another. She was mapping the world, the way she always had. With sound, with touch, with memory. She counted her steps, moving towards the sound of the fire. 20 steps. 30, 40. The air grew warmer, the smell of wood smoke stronger. Her outstretched hand finally brushed against something. Stone. It was rough and warm, the mantle of the great hearth. She ran her hands along it, feeling its size, its permanence. It was huge, big enough to roast an ox, big enough to swallow her whole. Using the hearth as her anchor, she began to explore its perimeter. The floor was uneven stone, worn smooth in some places, cracked in others. The air tasted of dust and disuse. How long had it been since anyone but the Alpha had walked these halls? Generations, she guessed. A lifetime of isolation. Hours bled into one another. Her stomach ached with a dull hunger, and her limbs grew stiff with cold and exhaustion. She found a hallway leading away from the great hall. The air was even colder here. She followed the wall with her fingertips, feeling the chill of the stone seep into her skin. She discovered doorways, great heavy things made of wood and iron. Most were locked, but one at the end of the long hall was slightly ajar. A faint draft slipped through the opening. Curiosity, a dangerous and forgotten feeling, tugged at her. She pushed it open. The hinges screamed in protest, the sound unnervingly loud. The scent hit her first. It was him. The room inside was smaller than the great hall, but the scent of him was concentrated here, pine and snow and that strange, sharp scent of lightning. But there was more. The faint smell of worn leather, old parchment, and something metallic like cooling steel. This was his place, his den. She took a hesitant step inside. The floor here was covered in something furs. They muffled the sound of her footsteps. There was a fire in here too, a small one, but it gave off a genuine warmth. The air was breathable, alive. Her hand, still exploring, brushed against the back of a chair. It was carved wood, worn smooth by long use. She traced its shape, her fingers finding the slight indentations where his hands would rest. Facing the fire, she imagined him sitting here, alone, year after year. Staring into flames he couldn't feel, in a silence broken only by the beating of his own cursed heart. A wave of something akin to pity washed over her. It was a foolish, dangerous emotion. He was a monster, a killer. But in this room, surrounded by the echoes of his loneliness, he felt like something else, a prisoner. Her fingers trailed away from the chair and found a table beside it. It was cluttered. She felt the shape of a book, its leather cover cracked with age. She felt a whetstone, and next to it, a small object, cool and smooth. She picked it up. It was a carving, wood. She turned it over and over in her hands, her fingertips tracing the lines. It was a wolf, exquisitely detailed. Its head was thrown back in a silent howl, its body tense with power and anguish. It was beautiful, and it was heartbreaking. The wood was worn smooth, as if it had been held 1,000 times. A floorboard creaked behind her. Mira froze. The wooden wolf still clutched in her hand. Her blood ran cold. She hadn't heard him approach, not a single sound. The furs on the floor had hidden his footsteps, but his scent, it was overwhelming. He was right behind her. The heat of his body was a physical wall at her back. She could hear his breathing. It was low and controlled, but she could feel the fury coming off him in waves. He was a storm about to break. She had disobeyed. She had sought him out. She had invaded his sanctuary. "What?" he growled, his voice a blade of ice against her ear. "Do you think you are doing in here?" She didn't turn. She couldn't. Her feet were rooted to the spot. I was cold, she whispered. The truth the only shield she had. The fire in the hall is too far away. I was looking for warmth. He was silent for a long moment. She felt his presence shift, his focus moving from her to the object in her hand. Give that to me, he said. His voice was no longer a growl. It was something quieter, something raw and exposed. Slowly, her hand trembling, she turned and held it out behind her, offering the small wooden wolf back into the darkness. She waited for him to snatch it from her, for his anger to finally spill over. Instead, she felt the shocking, impossible brush of his fingers against hers as he took the carving. His skin was not cold. It was searing hot, a touch that sent a jolt straight up her arm. It was calloused and rough, the touch of a warrior, a king. It was the first time in her life a man had touched her without flinching away from her unseeing eyes. His breath hitched. She heard it, and in that small broken sound, she heard 100 years of solitude. He had lived in absolute silence for a century, his world empty of touch and warmth. But standing here, in his own den, a blind girl had invaded his space and touched his soul. For the first time, he hated the sound of his own heart. His skin was fire. The shock of it was a white-hot lightning strike, a sensation so alien and powerful, it stole the breath from her lungs. She had expected ice. She had expected the grave cold she felt in the air around him, the chill that clung to the stones of his keep. But his touch was life, raw, burning, desperate life. He snatched his hand back, as if her skin had burned him in return. The little wooden wolf was gone from her grasp. The warmth vanished. In its place, a phantom heat lingered on her fingertips, a ghost of the connection that had just shattered the silence between them. She heard him take a ragged breath. Then another. He was fighting for control. She could hear it in the strained pull of air, in the tremor that ran through the floorboards beneath his weight. The slow, monstrous heartbeat was gone. In its place was the frantic, hammering pulse of a trapped animal. Get out! The words were a blade of jagged stone. He didn't just speak them, he ripped them from his throat. Before she could react, his hand closed around her upper arm. This touch was nothing like the first. It was a vice. Hard, merciless, and designed to inflict pain. His fingers dug into her flesh, and she gasped, a small, involuntary sound. The heat was still there, a furnace beneath the brutal grip, but now it was the heat of pure, undiluted rage. He hauled her backwards, out of his den, his stride long and punishing. She stumbled, her feet catching on the furs, on the stone. He didn't slow. He was a storm dragging her in its wake. She didn't fight, she didn't scream. She focused on the torrent of sensations. The brutal grip on her arm, the whirlwind of his scent, pine and fury and a new sharp smell of panic. The sounds of their passage through the castle, his heavy, furious footsteps and the frantic, soft scuffle of her own. He was mapping the cage for her. Turn left, 20 paces, right, down a short flight of 3 stone steps. He was showing her the boundaries of her world without a single word. He stopped so abruptly she collided with the solid wall of his back. He grunted, shoving her forward into an open doorway. The air inside was different. Stale, cold, but without the biting, unnatural frost of his presence. It smelled of old wool and dust and the faint, ghostly memory of a long-dead fire. "This is your room," he snarled, his voice echoing in the small space. "The basin in the corner has water. There is a bed. You will not leave this chamber. You will not explore. You will not seek me out again. Is that understood?" She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. The grip on her arm was the only thing holding her upright. He held on for a moment longer, his fingers seeming to burn their shape into her skin. She felt a tremor run through his hand, a fine, barely perceptible vibration of a battle being fought within him. He was at war with his own wolf, with his own curse, with the simple, damning fact of her touch. Then he released her. He shoved her, a final, violent act of rejection, sending her stumbling forward into the darkness of the room. The door slammed behind her. The sound was a thunderclap, a final, booming note of punctuation to his command. She heard the heavy, metallic scrape of a bolt being thrown on the outside. She was locked in. Her cage now had walls she could touch. For a long time, Mira simply stood there, her arm throbbing where he had held her. The phantom heat on her fingertips was finally beginning to fade. replaced by the deep, aching chill of the room. She listened. The sound of his footsteps retreated, growing fainter and fainter until they were swallowed by the oppressive silence of the keep. He was gone. She took a shaky breath. And another. The darkness in the room was absolute. But it was a familiar darkness, a simple absence of light. It was not the living, predatory darkness of his presence. Here, she could think. She began her ritual, her exploration. One hand outstretched, she walked the perimeter. The walls were cold, weeping with a faint dampness. It was a small room, maybe 12 paces by 12. In one corner, her questing fingers found the rough wool of a blanket on a low cot. The bed he'd mentioned. It was little more than a plank of wood with a thin mattress stuffed with what felt like old straw. The blanket was coarse, but it was dry. In another corner, she found the basin. Her fingers dipped into the water. It was achingly cold, but it was clean. There was a small bricked-up fireplace, its flue cold and choked with soot. No warmth to be found here. This was a room for storage, for forgetting. She sat on the edge of the cot. The rough blanket pulled around her shoulders. She was a tribute, a prisoner, an object to be locked away until he forgot she existed. His words echoed in her mind. If you are fortunate, you will be forgotten. But she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that he would not forget her. That brief, accidental touch had changed something. It had struck a chord in the deep, resonating silence of his soul, and the vibration was still humming in the air between them. He had felt it too. His rage was proof. You only rage at something that affects you. Days passed, or perhaps it was just one long night. Time had no meaning here. Hunger became a dull, constant ache in her belly. Thirst, a dryness in her throat. She drank the icy water from the basin and huddled under the thin blanket, lost in a cold, timeless twilight. She did not weep. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. They only made you cold. Then, a new sound. The scrape of the bolt. Mira sat bolt upright on the cot, her heart leaping into her throat. The sound was loud, violent, an intrusion into her small, silent world. The door creaked open. She didn't hear footsteps, but the air changed. The temperature in the room dropped by 10 degrees. The scent of winter and pine flooded the small space, chasing away the dust and damp. He was here, standing in the doorway. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She held her breath, listening. He was just watching her. She could feel his focus, a heavy weight on her skin. A soft thud broke the silence. The sound of a wooden tray being set on the stone floor, just inside the door. She smelled it, fresh bread, roasted meat. The scent was so rich, so full of life, it made her dizzy. He said nothing. She heard him take a single step back. The door creaked again. The bolt slid home. He was gone. Slowly, cautiously, she slid off the cot and made her way to the door. Her hands found the tray. Her fingers brushed against the rough crust of the bread. It was still warm. There was a chunk of meat and a wooden cup of water. She sank to the floor, her back against the cold, solid door, and ate. She ate slowly, deliberately, making the sensation last. It was more than just food. It was a message. He would not let her starve. The thought was a dangerous spark in the darkness. This act of bare, grudging sustenance was an admission, an acknowledgement of her existence. He wanted her locked away, silent, invisible, but he did not want her dead. This became their ritual. Once a day, or what she perceived as a day, the bolt would slide back. He would place the tray on the floor. He would stand there for a moment, his silent, oppressive presence filling the doorway. And then he would leave. He never spoke. She never spoke. It was a silent conversation held across a threshold she was forbidden to cross. During one of these strange, silent meetings, something new happened. He set the tray down, but he did not leave immediately. He lingered. The silence stretched on, growing tighter, thinner. His breathing was low and even, but she could feel the tension humming off of him. And then she felt it, a whisper against her skin. It wasn't a sound, it wasn't a touch, it was a pressure, a faint, cold tingling that started on the back of her neck and traced its way down her spine. It was the feeling of being watched by something that wasn't entirely human. It was his curse. She had been wrong. Her blindness did not make her immune. It only changed the way she perceived it. She couldn't see his gaze, but she could feel it. A phantom touch, a caress of pure, deadly power. It explored her senses, tasting her calm, searching for the fear it needed to feed on. She held herself perfectly still, her knuckles white where she gripped the blanket. She focused on her breathing, keeping it even. She would not give it the fear it wanted. She would not break. The feeling intensified, a cold fire spreading across her skin. It felt ancient, aware. It was not just a mindless force. It was intelligent, and it was curious about her. In his den, Kalen watched her, his hand braced against the stone doorframe. His knuckles were white. A cold sweat beaded on his brow. He couldn't stop himself from coming here. He couldn't stop himself from looking. Every time he saw her, sitting in the darkness he had condemned her to, a darkness that mirrored her own, a war raged inside him. His wolf, the beast that had been silent for a century, paced the borders of his soul, whining for a contact he could not allow, but it was the curse that terrified him now. It had always been a part of him, a cold, dead weight in his soul, a weapon he was forced to carry, but it had been dormant, a sleeping predator. Her presence had woken it up. Now when he looked at her, he could feel it stir. It coiled in his vision, a shadow that moved at the edges of his sight. It felt hungry, not for death, for something else. It was drawn to her, to the empty spaces where her sight should be. It wanted to know what she was. It wanted to touch her, to see what would happen when its power met her unique darkness. He was losing control, not of his wolf, but of the ancient poison in his blood. He saw her shiver, a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor. She felt it. She felt him. He had to leave. He had to get away before he did more than just look. He pulled back, slamming the door, the sound of the bolt a desperate, final act. He leaned against the cold stone of the hallway, his heart hammering against his ribs. The darkness inside him had whispered against her skin. And he knew, with a chilling certainty that froze him to the core, it would not be the last time. It was learning her name. The phantom touch of his gaze became a daily torment. It was no longer just a cold whisper. It was a tangible presence, a pressure that settled over her the moment the bolt on her door was thrown. It traced the line of her jaw, the curve of her throat, the delicate shell of her ear. It was a cold, intimate exploration, and it left her skin feeling raw, exposed. She learned its rhythms, its textures. It felt like frost spreading across a window pane, intricate, beautiful, and utterly lethal. It was him, but it was not him. It was the ancient, hungry thing that lived behind his eyes, and it was growing stronger, bolder. Mira learned to brace for it. When she heard the scrape of the bolt, she would pull the thin wool blanket tighter around her shoulders, a pathetic shield against an intangible assault. She would focus on the sound of her own breathing, on the steady beat of her own heart, anchoring herself in her own body while his curse tried to unmake her from the outside in. He never spoke. The tray of food was her only proof that the man still existed, that he had not been entirely consumed by the monster in his gaze. Sometimes the bread was still warm. Sometimes the water had a trace of mint, as if from a clean spring. Small, almost imperceptible signs of something, not care, but a lingering connection he was fighting and failing to sever. One day the ritual changed. The bolt slid back. The door creaked open. The familiar drop in temperature, the immediate pressure of his gaze on her skin. She tensed, waiting for the thud of the tray. It never came. Instead, she heard a soft sound, a rustle of fabric, and then a scent she had only smelled once before, in his den, old parchment. He was still standing there. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. The frosty touch of his gaze was more intense than ever before, a focused, piercing cold against her temple. He was trying to do something, to see something, to break something. Why? His voice, the sound of it after weeks of silence, was a shock that jolted through her. It was rough, like gravel dragged over stone, thick with disuse. Mira did not answer immediately. She tilted her head, listening to the word hang in the air between them. It was a splinter of sound, full of jagged edges, pain, confusion, rage. "Why what, Alpha?" she finally asked, her own voice a soft counterpoint to his harshness. "Why are you not afraid?" he demanded. "I can feel it, the thing that lives in my eyes. It touches you, it tastes you. I know you feel it, yet you sit there, like stone. Feeling and fearing are two different things, she said, her hands clutching the blanket. I feel the cold, I do not fear the winter. A low growl rumbled in his chest. It was the sound of a beast straining at its chains. You play with words, little bird, he snarled. You are in a cage. The monster is at the door, and you tell me you do not fear it? You have not harmed me. The words were simple, true, and they struck him like a physical blow. She heard his sharp intake of breath, a sound of pure shock. In a century of being feared, of being a curse and a nightmare, no one had ever said those words to him. You have not harmed me. He, who had shattered minds with a glance. He, who had driven men to madness without lifting a finger. I locked you in this room, he bit out, his voice strained. I give you barely enough food to survive. Is that not harm? That is survival, she corrected gently. Both for me and for you. The silence that followed was absolute. He was a statue in the doorway, the cold pouring off him in waves. She had seen it. Her blind eyes had seen the truth of his prison more clearly than anyone with sight ever had. His cruelty was a shield. His castle was his cage. Locking her away was as much about protecting her from him as it was about punishing her. He took a step into the room. Just one, but it was a universe of change. He had crossed the threshold. He was no longer the jailer at the door. He was in the cell with her. The scent of him was overwhelming now. Snow and pine and the electric hum of his power. The cold was so intense, it felt like a fire of its own, burning her skin. You know nothing of what he whispered, and the sound was laced with a century of self-loathing. I know the sound of your solitude, she whispered back. I know the scent of your pain, and I know the feel of a prison when I am in one. He was close now, so close. She could feel the air stir as he moved, could feel the heat of his body warring with the chill of his curse. He knelt. The sound of his knees hitting the stone floor was loud in the small room. He was putting himself on her level. She felt the frosty touch of his gaze slide from her face down to her hands, which were clenched tightly in her lap. Your knuckles are white, he observed, his voice a low murmur. You are not made of stone after all. No, she agreed, her voice trembling slightly for the first time. I am not. His hand moved. She felt the air shift, felt the warmth of him before the touch came. His fingers, large and calloused, brushed against her clenched fist. It was not a grip. It was a question, a hesitant, uncertain touch that was so at odds with the monster she knew him to be. The contact was an explosion. Heat and cold collided, his burning skin against hers, the icy whisper of his curse against her soul. A jolt, sharp and powerful, shot up her arm, straight to her heart. It felt like lightning striking a dead tree, the shock so immense it threatened to split her in two. She gasped, her fingers flying open instinctively. His hand closed around hers, and the world ended. It wasn't darkness. She knew darkness. This was nothing, a void. An absolute absence of sound, of scent, of feeling. The connection to her own body was severed. She was adrift in a silent, endless emptiness. The curse. He had done more than look. He had touched her. The physical contact had amplified his power, creating a direct conduit. His gaze was no longer a phantom touch on her skin. It was inside her head. It was scouring her soul, searching for the light it was meant to extinguish. But it found none, only her quiet, familiar darkness, and it raged. It was a silent, screaming tempest in the void. An ancient power furious at being denied its purpose. It clawed at the walls of her mind, seeking a memory, a dream, a sliver of sight to corrupt and destroy. It found nothing but echoes and sounds and smells. From a great distance she felt a tremor, a vibration. It was him, Kalen. He was roaring, not with his voice, with his soul. He was fighting it. He was trying to pull it back. He had felt the shift the moment the curse had surged through their connection, and he was trying to sever it. Mira. His voice. It wasn't a sound, it was a thought, a desperate, broken plea pushed into the void. It was the first time he had used her name. The name was an anchor. She clung to it, a single point of light in the overwhelming nothingness. Mira. She pushed back, not with force. She had none. She pushed back with her own emptiness. She opened the gates of her lifelong darkness and let the curse see. She showed it the landscape of her world, a world built of sound, of touch, of the memory of a sun she could no longer see. She showed it that there was nothing there for it to kill. The raging tempest faltered. It hesitated. It tasted her reality and found it indigestible. It was a predator with no prey, a fire with no fuel. With a final silent shriek of frustration, the pressure receded. Sound rushed back in first, a ragged, desperate gasping for air. It was her own, then scent, pine, snow, and the coppery tang of blood. Then touch, the cold stone floor beneath her, the rough wool of the blanket, and his hands, both of them now, gripping hers with a desperate, trembling strength. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her throat was raw. Mira. He said her name again, this time aloud. It was a prayer, a curse, a confirmation. His voice was shattered. She felt something wet and warm drip onto her hand. She lifted her free hand, her movements clumsy, and reached for his face. Her fingers brushed against a rough cheek, the scrape of stubble. They traced a line upwards and found the source of the wetness. Tears, the alpha of the Blackwood, the monster whose gaze was death. He was weeping. His curse, for the first time, had been met not with fear, but with an emptiness it could not comprehend. And in that moment of its confusion, for the first time in a century, Kalen Dross was free of it. He was just a man holding the hands of a blind girl in a dark room. He lowered his head until his forehead rested against hers. His breath was a hot, shuddering wave against her skin. "What are you?" he whispered, his voice thick with awe and terror. She could not answer. She was too lost in the shocking, impossible sensation of the warm, salty tears of a monster dripping onto her skin. The gaze she was never meant to feel had shown her not his power, but his pain. And the mark it had left behind was not a scar. It was a beginning. He did not let her go. His forehead remained pressed against hers, his hands still gripping her own. The room was no longer cold. His body heat, raw and unchecked, radiated into the small space, chasing the damp chill from the stones. He was a furnace, and she was huddled at its core, trembling in the aftershock of the void. His tears stopped, but the shuddering breaths continued. It was the sound of the man relearning how to breathe without the weight of a century on his chest. "It was quiet," he finally whispered, the words a rough vibration that traveled from his skull to hers. "Inside my head, when it was with you, it was quiet." Mira understood. The curse was a noise, a constant silent screaming in his soul that he had lived with for so long he had forgotten what true silence felt like. Her darkness had absorbed it, muted it, if only for a moment. Slowly, gently, he drew back. The loss of contact was a physical ache. He rose to his feet, a towering shadow in the darkness of the room. She heard him move to the door, his footsteps heavy, uncertain. He didn't leave. He stood there, his back to her. "The door will no longer be locked," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the raw emotion from moments before. He was rebuilding his walls. "You may go where you wish, within the keep." Then he was gone. He did not close the door. He left it open, a sliver of the colder hallway air, bleeding into her small, warm space. An invitation, a dare. She did not move for a long time. The scent of him lingered, but it was different now. The sharp, sterile scent of the curse was diminished, and what was left was purely him, pine and winter, and man. A scent that her wolf, a creature she had almost forgotten, recognized. Mate. The word was a whisper in the deepest part of her mind. A faint instinctual hum she had never felt before. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. Over the next few days, the keep transformed. It was still a place of deep silence and shadow, but it was no longer her prison. Timidly at first, then with growing confidence, Mira began to explore. She let the open doorway of her room be her anchor, her starting point, venturing further down the cold stone hallways each time. She found a library where the air was thick with the scent of decaying paper and leather, a ghost of 1,000 stories she would never read. She found a vast, empty ballroom where the faintest sound of her footsteps echoed like a crowd of ghosts. She found an armory, the air tasting of old steel and oil. The castle was a mausoleum, a monument to a life that had ended 100 years ago. She never saw him, but she felt him. Sometimes she would enter a room and the air would still hold a trace of his warmth, the faint echo of his scent. He was watching her. She knew it. He was a ghost in his own home, tracking her movements from the shadows, ensuring she kept to her side of their unspoken bargain. The food continued to appear, but now she would find it on the great table in the main hall. A loaf of bread, a wedge of cheese, sometimes a bowl of thick stew, still steaming. He was providing for her, but keeping his distance. The memory of their connection, of what his curse had done when amplified by touch, was a chasm between them. One afternoon, guided by a faint breeze, she found her way outside. She stepped through a massive archway onto a stone terrace. The air was cold and clean, and it carried the scent of snow. It had snowed. The ground was covered in a thick, soft blanket of it, muffling all sound. The world felt hushed, peaceful. She lifted her face to the sky, letting the weak winter sun warm her skin. It was the first real sunlight she had felt in weeks. She breathed it in, a taste of freedom that was so potent it made her dizzy. A twig snapped nearby. She froze, her head turning towards the sound. "Stay where you are," his voice commanded. It came from her left, perhaps 20 paces away. It was tight, controlled. "I only wanted some air," she said softly, not moving a muscle. "The air in here is the same as the air in there," he retorted, but there was no heat in it. She heard the soft crunch of his boots in the snow as he moved. He wasn't coming closer. He was pacing, back and forth, a caged wolf. "Is this where you come?" she asked, her voice gentle. "When the silence inside gets too loud." He stopped pacing. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken words. "You presume much, little bird," he finally said, his voice low. "You carved a wolf howling at the moon," she replied. It wasn't the carving of a happy man. She heard a sharp, dangerous sound, the hiss of a blade being drawn from a sheath. "Do not speak of things you do not understand," he warned, his voice a razor's edge. "You have felt a flicker of what I carry. You cannot possibly comprehend the whole of it." "Then show me," she dared, turning her body fully towards him. She held her hands out at her sides, palms up, an act of complete surrender. "Let me feel it again. Let me understand." No, the word was a violent, absolute rejection. "You think it is a thing to be understood, tamed? It is a poison. It devoured my father. It devoured his father before him. It waits for me to show a moment of weakness, a flicker of hope, and then it will take me, too." This was the heart of it, the truth of his fear. It wasn't just that he would harm others. It was that the curse would consume him. "When I touched you," he continued, his voice dropping to a raw, painful whisper, "it enjoyed it. It was pleased. It had never reacted that way before. With the others, it was a simple act, a release, a kill. With you, it was curious. It wants to know you, and that is a death sentence I will not grant it." His love was the poison. Any affection, any connection, was fuel for the curse. His isolation was not just a shield for others, it was his own cage, built to starve the monster within. "It is why they sent you, isn't it?" he mused, a bitter, broken sound. "The blind bride, the perfect vessel, you quiet the beast. They must have known, an old legend, a forgotten prophecy." He was piecing it together, the cruel calculation of her own pack. They hadn't just been getting rid of their damaged goods. They had been using her as a weapon, a key. A sudden sharp cry split the air. Not human. It was the sound of a rabbit, high and terrified. It came from the woods just beyond the terrace. Before Mira could process it, she heard a blur of motion, a grunt from Kaylin, a heavy thud in the snow, then a low, guttural snarl that was not entirely human. "Kaylin," she called out, her voice sharp with sudden fear. Silence. Then another snarl, this one closer, deeper, animalistic. The air grew thick, charged with a primal energy that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. The scent of him was changing. The man was receding, and something wilder was taking its place. Musk, blood, wet fur, his wolf. "Go inside," he growled, and his voice was distorted, halfway between man and beast. It was a struggle. He was fighting for every word. "Now, get inside!" She heard the sound of claws scraping against stone. He was on the terrace with her, but she didn't run. She stood her ground, her face turned toward the terrifying sounds, towards him. "What is happening?" she asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. "A hunter," he snarled. "From your pack. He was watching. Scented wolfsbane on his arrows." Wolfsbane, a poison to their kind. The hunter hadn't been after a rabbit. He had been hunting the alpha. Her people had not just sent her as a tribute, they had sent her as bait. She felt a wave of nausea. Her father, Elder Maeve, they had condemned her to this, hoping the monster would be distracted or weakened by her presence, hoping a hunter could finish the job. "He is dead now," Kaylin growled, and the finality of it sent a chill down her spine. "But the poison, it weakens the man. It strengthens the beast." She could hear it in his voice. The man was losing. The wolf, enraged by the poison and the threat, was clawing its way to the surface. He was shifting, an uncontrolled, violent transformation brought on by poison and rage. "Mira, run!" he choked out, the name a desperate plea. She took a step towards him. "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "Foolish girl," he roared, and the sound was almost completely beast. "I will tear you apart, the curse and the wolf. Together, they will not know you." She took another step. She could smell the blood, his blood, the hunter's blood. The scent was thick, metallic. "You called my name," she said, her voice a lifeline thrown into the storm of his transformation. "The man is still in there. Fight him, Kaylin." She heard a terrible sound, a wrenching, tearing noise, accompanied by the snap of bone. He cried out, a sound of pure agony that was both man and wolf. He was losing. She was 10 feet away from him now. The air around him was a vortex of rage and pain. She could feel the raw, untamed power rolling off him. Any sane person would have fled long ago. But her wolf, the quiet, timid thing inside her, was not afraid. It was whining, not in fear. In sympathy, it recognized the pain of its mate. She reached out her hand into the space between them. "Kaylin," she whispered, her voice carrying across the snow-filled silence. "Your wolf knows me. Let him see me. Let him remember." She heard a low, rumbling growl, the sound of a landslide starting. He was gathering himself to spring, to kill. His love was the poison, his rage was the beast. And she was standing in the path of both, armed with nothing but his name on her lips and a faith in the man she had only ever touched in the dark. The air fractured. It wasn't a sound. It was a feeling. A violent tearing of reality as the last vestiges of the man gave way to the beast. The growl in his chest deepened into a chest-shaking rumble, a promise of death that vibrated through the soles of Mira's boots. The scent of him was overwhelming now, blood, enraged wolf, and the cold, metallic tang of his curse, all roiling together into a storm of pure destruction. He was going to kill her. Her name, her plea, it had all been for nothing. The poison was too strong, the rage too absolute. She should run. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at her to turn, to flee back into the stone keep and bar the door. But her feet were roots, anchored to the frozen ground. To run was to abandon him. To run was to accept that the monster had won. She held her hand out, a fragile offering to the hurricane. "Kaylin," she said again, her voice a thread in the roaring wind of his fury. The monster lunged. She heard the explosive crunch of snow as he launched himself across the terrace. A black wave of sound and fury and teeth aimed directly at her throat. There was no time to scream, no time to even breathe. This was the end. But in the fraction of a second before the impact, something impossible happened. She felt a whisper of cold against her outstretched palm, a phantom touch. It was not the biting frost of his curse. It was something else, a flicker of recognition, a memory. His jaws, which should have closed around her throat, snapped shut an inch from her skin. The sound was like a bear trap, a wet, violent clap of teeth and power that made her flinch. Hot, foul breath washed over her face, thick with the smell of blood and rage. She felt the wetness of his nose press against her palm. A low, uncertain whine rumbled in his massive chest, a sound of profound confusion. The wolf knew her. Even through the poison, through the blind rage, the primal core of the beast recognized its mate. The man was gone, lost in the storm, but the wolf remembered her scent. her calm, the feel of her hand. He did not attack. He did not retreat. He stood over her, a colossal, trembling mountain of fur and muscle, his ragged breaths ghosting across her skin. She could feel the tremors running through his body, a war being fought in every fiber of his being. The poison urged him to kill. His wolfish instinct, ancient and absolute, screamed at him to protect. Slowly, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, Mira moved her other hand. She brought it up to his massive head, her fingers sinking into the thick, coarse fur of his ruff. It was damp with snow and blood. He flinched at the contact, a growl tearing from his throat, but he did not pull away. "It's all right," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I am here. I am not afraid." She stroked his head, her movements slow, rhythmic. She spoke to him, not with words of command, but with soft, meaningless sounds, the kind of sounds one uses to soothe a frightened animal. She poured all of her calm, all of her acceptance, into her touch. She was not trying to tame the beast. She was trying to reach the man trapped inside it. He leaned into her touch, a fractional, almost imperceptible movement. The deep guttural growl softened into a low, pained rumble. She felt the tension in his powerful shoulders lessen by a fraction. And then she felt the cold. It started at her fingertips, where her hand rested on his head, the icy, invasive touch of his curse. In his wolf form, with his control shattered by the poison, it was bleeding out of him, raw and untamed. It seeped into her skin, a lethal chill that traveled up her arm, seeking her heart. She gasped, the cold so intense it was a physical pain. It was the void, but different, wilder. It was not just looking for a light to extinguish, it was looking for life to drain. She had to pull away. If she held on, it would kill her. It would freeze the blood in her veins. But if she let go, the beast's rage would surge again. The fragile connection would be broken. He would be lost. She made her choice. She held on. She pushed past the pain, driving her fingers deeper into his fur, anchoring herself to him. She let the cold wash over her, let it sink into her bones, and she focused all of her will, all of her being, on a single thought, a single name, Kaylin. She didn't speak it. She thought it. She projected it through their point of contact. A silent plea sent directly from her soul to his. "Kaylin, come back." The cold intensified. Her arm began to go numb. Black spots danced in her vision, though she had no vision to begin with. Her own darkness was being invaded by a deeper, more absolute one. She felt the beast shudder. A violent, convulsive tremor, a terrible, whining cry was ripped from its throat, a sound of unbearable agony. It was the sound of a soul being torn in two. "Kaylin!" Her silent scream was one of pure desperation. And then a flicker. Deep within the raging storm of the beast, she felt a response, a spark of warmth, a flicker of the man. He was there. He was fighting. He had heard her. He was using her as his own anchor, pulling himself back from the brink, hand over hand, up the lifeline she had thrown him. The pressure of the curse faltered. The intense cold receded for a moment, and a wave of warmth from his body surged back. The wolf let out another cry, but this one was different. It was less rage, more pain, the sound of transformation in reverse. She heard the sickening crunch of bones realigning. A human groan of agony replaced the animalistic snarl. The massive weight leaning against her began to change, to shrink, to soften. He collapsed. He fell against her, his full weight driving her back into the soft snow. He wasn't a wolf anymore. He was a man, a naked, bleeding, unconscious man. His head rested in her lap, his face turned towards her stomach. His breathing was shallow, ragged. She could feel the sticky wetness of blood from a wound on his shoulder, where the hunter's arrow must have struck. The terrace was silent again, save for the sound of their combined, desperate breaths. The snow continued to fall, soft and white, blanketing the scene in a strange, surreal peace. Mira lay there, her numb arm still resting on his shoulder, her body aching with a cold so deep it felt as if it would never leave. She had faced the monster, she had touched the beast, and she had called the man home. She didn't know how long they stayed like that. Time had ceased to have meaning, but eventually she felt him stir. A low groan escaped his lips. His head moved, nuzzling weakly against her. "Mira?" Her name. It was a broken, shredded whisper, the voice of a man who had been to hell and back. But it was his. It was human. It was her name on a monster's lips. And in the frozen silence of the cursed keep, under the softly falling snow, it sounded like a victory. He was weak. He was bleeding. He was poisoned. But he was himself. "I'm here," she whispered, her own voice thick with unshed tears. She smoothed his damp hair back from his forehead. His skin was feverishly hot. The poison was still in him. "You stayed," he murmured, his voice slurred with pain and exhaustion. He sounded amazed, as if it were the single most astonishing thing that had ever happened to him. "I told you," she said, her voice choking. "I am not afraid of the winter." He tried to say something else, but his words dissolved into a groan of pain. His body went limp again, his breathing growing even shallower. The fever was taking him. The wolfsbane was winning. She had called him back, but she couldn't save him, not alone. He was too heavy to move, and the cold was beginning to leach the life from both of them. Despair, cold and sharp, pierced through her exhaustion. She had won the battle, only to lose the war. He was going to die here, in her arms, in the snow. And as that thought took hold, a new sound reached her ears. A howl, not from Kaelin. This one was distant. And it was answered by another, and another. They were coming from the woods. From his territory. For a century, the Blackwood had been silent. Its alpha a recluse, its pack scattered and leaderless. But the uncontrolled shift, the roar of their alpha in a battle for his own soul, had been a beacon, a summons. His pack had heard him, and they were coming home. The first to arrive was a she-wolf, her fur the color of old silver. She emerged from the tree line like a ghost, silent and wary. Mira smelled her before she heard her, the scent of frost-covered earth, old loyalty, and a cautious, questioning hope. She stopped at the edge of the terrace, her golden eyes, as Mira would later learn they were, fixed on the scene, on her fallen alpha, cradled in the lap of a strange, scentless female. Mira did not move. She simply held Kaelin, her own warmth a failing shield against the encroaching cold. She felt the she-wolf's appraisal, a silent weighing of threat and intent. "He is poisoned," Mira said, her voice clear and steady in the snow-filled quiet. "He needs his pack." The she-wolf took a hesitant step forward. Then another, more shapes began to emerge from the woods behind her. Huge, powerful wolves, their breaths pluming in the frigid air. They were an army of ghosts, drawn from their long solitude by the sound of their king's pain. They formed a silent, watchful circle around the terrace. The silver she-wolf, who she would come to know as Anya, Kaelin's beta from a lifetime ago, approached. She nudged Kaelin's still form with her nose, a low whine of distress rumbling in her chest. Then she looked at Mira. Her gaze was intelligent, searching. She smelled the alpha's blood on Mira, but she also smelled his scent, claiming and protective, clinging to Mira's skin like a second soul. She smelled the absence of fear. With a soft noise of decision, Anya turned and let out a series of short, sharp barks. Two of the largest wolves broke from the circle and trotted forward. In a fluid, practiced movement, they shifted. The sound of it was less violent than Kaelin's had been, a soft restructuring of bone and sinew. Two tall, weathered shifters stood in their place, their eyes still holding the wildness of the wolf. They lifted their alpha as if he weighed nothing, their movements gentle, reverent. Anya shifted as well, becoming a tall woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that had seen a century of winter. She looked at Mira, who was still sitting in the snow, shivering and covered in Kaelin's blood. "Come," Anya said, her voice raspy from disuse. "You have saved the heart of this pack. We will not let the cold claim you." She helped Mira to her feet, her touch surprisingly gentle. She wrapped a thick fur cloak, brought by another shifter, around Mira's trembling shoulders. The warmth was immediate, profound. It smelled of wolf and home. They were led back into the keep. For the first time, it was not silent. There were footsteps, hushed voices, the crackle of a dozen new fires being lit in hearths that had been cold for generations. The ghosts were coming back to life. They took Kaelin to the Alpha's chambers, the very room Mira had stumbled into. They laid him on the great fur-covered bed. An old shifter, a healer named Bryn, immediately set to work, his gnarled hands surprisingly deft as he cleaned the wound and began grinding herbs that filled the air with a sharp, clean scent. Mira was guided to a chair by the fire, a warm, spiced broth pressed into her hands. She listened to the quiet, efficient work of the pack. They moved with a purpose that had been sleeping for 100 years. They had their alpha back. They had a reason to be a pack again. She stayed by the fire, a silent sentinel. She could not see him, but she could hear the ragged rhythm of his breathing, could smell the fever and the poison warring within him. The pack members came and went, speaking in low tones. They would glance at her, the strange blind girl who smelled of their alpha. There was curiosity in their scent, but no malice. She was the one who had stayed, the one who had called him back. To the pack, that was everything. For 3 days, he burned. Mira never left the room. She slept in the chair, waking whenever his breathing hitched, or he cried out in his delirium. Anya would bring her food, would speak to her quietly, telling her stories of a younger Kaelin, a proud alpha before the curse had fully taken root, before it had forced him to drive away everyone he loved. On the 3rd night, the fever broke. Mira was dozing when the change came. The air in the room shifted. The oppressive heat of his fever lessened, and his ragged, shallow breaths deepened into a slow, even rhythm. The sound of sleep. Not the coma of poison, but true, healing sleep. She stood and made her way to the bed. Anya was there, a damp cloth on Kaelin's forehead. "He will live," the beta whispered, her voice thick with relief. "The poison is gone. You kept him anchored. The healers say his heart would have given out, but he was fighting to get back to you." Mira reached out, her hand finding his. His skin was no longer burning. It was warm, human. She laced her fingers through his. He stirred, his hand tightening around hers. "Mira," he murmured, his voice groggy with sleep. It was the first word he'd spoken. Her name. She knelt by the bed, leaning her head against their joined hands. She didn't need to say anything. He knew she was there. When he was strong enough, he told her everything. He told her of the Dross curse, passed from father to son, an ancient poison that fed on connection and twisted love into a weapon. Each generation grew more isolated, more feared, until he was the last of his line, a king in a dead castle. And she, in turn, told him of her life. Of a world of darkness, of being the broken piece in a family that valued wholeness above all else, of being a sacrifice. In the quiet of his chambers, surrounded by the hum of his reawakening pack, they found the truth of it. He was the monster who had been forced into solitude. She was the girl who had been raised in it. His cage had been stone and fear. Hers had been darkness and pity. The curse was not gone. It was a part of his blood, a shadow that would always walk beside him, but it was quieter. Her presence was like a balm to it. It did not rage. It watched, and as long as he was with her, the man, the alpha, was stronger. One spring morning, when the snow had melted and the scent of damp earth filled the air, he led her out to the terrace. The pack was there, gathered in a respectful silence. Anya, Bryn, dozens of shifters who had found their way home. Kaelin stood before them, his hand holding Mira's. He was still scarred, still formidable, but the haunted, broken look was gone from his scent, replaced by a quiet strength. "For a century, I have been your alpha in name only, also," he said, his voice ringing with a command that had not been heard in generations. "I allowed a curse to rule me, to isolate me, to shatter our pack. No more." He turned to Mira, and though she could not see it, she felt the warmth of his smile. "This is Mira. She is blind to my curse, but she has seen my soul. She is my mate. She is your Luna." A murmur of assent went through the crowd. There was no hesitation. They had seen her courage. They had smelled his devotion. This was right. This was the renewal of their pack. He drew her close, his arm wrapping around her waist. He leaned down, his lips brushing against her ear. "The curse feeds on love, little bird," he whispered, his voice for her alone. "For 100 years I tried to starve it, but you have shown me how to fight it. Not by starving it, but by feeding the man it lives inside." He was right. His love for her, the very thing he had feared would be the poison, had become the antidote. It didn't destroy the curse, but it gave him the strength to control it, to rule it instead of being ruled by it. She lifted her face to the sun. a real smile gracing her lips for the first time in memory. She couldn't see the light, but she could feel it on her skin. She could feel its warmth in the hand that held hers. The moon had seen their scars long enough. Today, she watched them heal.